Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a combat-themed commander deck with Winota, Joiner of Forces, as its general. Winota, Joiner of Forces, hails from Ikoria, lair of behemoths, and is a 4/4 human warrior for 2 in Boros colors. Whenever a non-human creature we control attacks, we look at the top 6 cards of our library. Right away, notice the text here. The ability triggers whenever a creature we control attacks. This is not a whenever one or more creatures attack type of trigger. For each one creature we control that is declared as an attacker, we look at the top 6 cards of our library. As we'll see throughout this video, this ability is going to get out of hand very quickly. From these 6 cards, we may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and then we put the rest of the cards on the bottom of our library in a random order. The creature gains indestructible until end of turn. Note, a human entering the battlefield this way will not trigger its own or any other attack triggers because it comes into play tapped and attacking. We want as many non-human creatures to attack as possible in order to trigger Winota's ability early, often, and throughout the game. To do so, the core of this build will be sculpted by a vision of creating non-human creature tokens for the purposes of putting powerful human creature cards from our library onto the battlefield through our general's attack trigger. With such an overwhelming army, our path to victory will be easier than Sunday morning. We begin the core of this build with a suite of spells that create non-human creature tokens. Dragon Fodder and Krenko's Command are identical cards that create 2 1/1 red goblins. For a mana value of 1 and a white, Servo Exhibition creates 2 1/1 colorless servos, and Clowning Around creates 2 1/1 white clown robots. There is a chance to create a third if our D6 rolling skills are up to par. Molten Birth creates 2 1/1 red elementals, and if our coin-flipping skills are up to par, we return this card to our hand upon resolution. Hordling Outburst creates 3 1/1 red goblins, while Spectral Procession creates 3 1/1 white spirits with flying. SRAM's Expertise creates 3 1/1 colorless servos, and as a bonus, we may cast a spell with mana value of 3 or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. At instant speed, Raise the Alarm creates 2 1/1 white soldiers. Midnight Haunting creates 2 1/1 white spirits with flying. You See a Pair of Goblins creates 2 1/1 red goblins, or gives creatures we control +2/+0 until end of turn. The temporary extra boost in power could be a game ender. For a bigger bang for our mana spending buck, Secure the Waste creates X 1/1 white warriors. Grand Crescendo creates X 1/1 green and white citizens and gives creatures we control indestructible until end of turn. Martial Coup creates X 1/1 white soldiers, and if X is 5 or more, we destroy all other creatures. Finale of Glory creates X 2/2 white soldiers with vigilance, and if X is 10 or more, we also create X 4/4 white angels with flying and vigilance. We're gonna need a bigger deck. For sources of repeatable or ongoing creature token production, Skrell's Hive creates a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might with Toxic 1 that can't block at the beginning of our upkeep. We also lose 1 life. Also at the beginning of our upkeep, we put a muster counter on Assemble the Legion. Then we create a 1/1 red and white soldier with haste for each muster counter on it. If left unchecked, this enchantment can completely take over a game. Rabble Rousing has Hideaway 5, which means when it enters the battlefield, we look at the top 5 cards of our library and exile 1 of them face down. We put the rest of these cards on the bottom of our library in a random order. Whenever we attack with 1 or more creatures, we create that many 1/1 green and white citizens. Then, if we control 10 or more creatures, a feat easily accomplished in this build, then we may play the exile card that was hidden away without paying its mana cost. Rabble Rousing essentially doubles the number of creatures we control if we send our entire army into combat, and it is another enchantment that can get completely out of control if left unchecked by our opponents. Our token-producing effects are not just limited to instants, sorceries, and enchantments. Our land base can contribute to our diverse creature token army. We can pay 1 and a red mana and tap Care Keep to create a 0/1 red kobold. Remember, we don't need the creatures to deal combat damage in order to trigger Winota. We simply must declare non-human creatures as attackers, and a 0/1 kobold certainly applies here. By paying 3 and a red mana and discarding Sokin's on Crucible of Defiance, we create 2 1/1 colorless spirits with haste. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature we control. Winota approves. For the same 3 and 1 red mana, Den of the Bugbear becomes a 3/2 red goblin with, whenever this creature attacks, we create a 1/1 red goblin that's tapped and attacking. That's goblins making goblins. Even a portion of our land base can trigger Winota's ability without creating creature tokens. By paying 1 and until end of turn, Blinkmoth Nexus becomes a 1/1 colorless Blinkmoth with flying. Inkmoth Nexus follows suit, but the creature is a Phyrexian Blinkmoth instead, and it also has Infect. Mishra's Factory becomes a 2/2 colorless assembly worker, while Mishra's Foundry becomes the same, but the activation cost is 2 instead of 1. Crawling Barrens has a hefty activation cost of 4, but it gets 2+1/+1 counters on it, in addition to providing the option of becoming a 0/0 elemental until end of turn. For 2 in Boros colors, Needlespires becomes a 2/1 red and white elemental with double strike until end of turn. These lands trigger Winota if they are creatures and declared as attackers. So far, we have inundated the core of this build with various ways to create non-human creatures. Now, let's add our human creature cards and complete our Winota-driven synergy. Let's begin with human creatures that create creature tokens when they enter the battlefield. Pia and Kirin Nalar create 2 1/1 colorless Thopters with flying, and we can pay 2 and a red mana and sacrifice an artifact in order to deal 2 damage to any target. Geist Honored Monk creates 2 1/1 white spirits with flying. She also has vigilance, and her power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures we control. Knight Captain of Eos creates 2 1/1 white soldiers, and we can pay a white mana and sacrifice a soldier we control in order to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Captain of the Watch creates 3 1/1 white soldiers. She also has vigilance and gives other soldiers we control +1/+1 and vigilance as well. Evangel of Heliod creates a number of 1/1 white soldiers equal to our devotion to white, which is factored by counting the number of white mana symbols in the mana costs of permanents we control. Lena, Selfless Champion, creates a number of 1/1 white soldiers equal to the number of non-token creatures we control. We also can sacrifice her and give all creatures we control with power less than Lena's indestructible until end of turn. There is an unsurprisingly strong presence of soldiers in this build. There are some humans that have attack triggers that create creature tokens as well. Myral's Shield of Argive creates X 1/1 colorless soldiers, where X is equal to the number of soldiers we control. She could create a lot of soldier tokens in this build. During our turn, Myral also shuts down our opponents from casting spells and activating abilities of artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Hero of Bladehold creates 2 1/1 white soldiers, and she also has Battlecry, meaning that when she attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Silverwing Squadron creates a number of 2/2 white knights with vigilance equal to the number of opponents we have. It flies, has vigilance, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures we control. This human knight could be a massive threat on the battlefield, and it has the potential of one-shotting an opponent with its robust power and evasion. There are other ways for our humans to create creature tokens. If Winota is on our side of the battlefield at the beginning of combat, then Loyal Apprentice creates a 1/1 colorless Thopter with flying that has haste until end of turn. Although it may be unlikely, at the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures than we do, then Keeper of the Accord creates a 1/1 white soldier. More likely to trigger is this human soldier's second ability. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more lands than we do, then we search our library for a basic Plains card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Whenever we cast a white permanent spell, Defiler of Faith creates a 1/1 white soldier. This Phyrexian human also has an ability that provides an additional cost to cast white permanent spells. We may pay 2 life instead of paying white mana for these spells. Using our life total as a pseudo mana resource makes the clock tick quicker for our opponents. Lastly, whenever we're dealt damage, Darien, King of Kaldor, creates that many 1/1 white soldiers. Notice that these tokens are created from any damage dealt to us, not just combat damage, and not just from our opponents. Now let's turn our attention to some humans that can strengthen and enhance our army. Benalish Marshal gives other creatures we control +1/+1. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, Gold Knight Commander gives creatures we control +1/+1 until end of turn. When Rick, Steadfast Leader, comes into play, we choose 2 abilities from among First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. Human creatures we control have each of these abilities, and as long as we control at least 4 humans we control also get +2/+2. Adriana, Captain of the Guard, has melee and gives other creatures we control melee as well. Whenever a creature with melee attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each opponent we attacked this combat. If we attack 3 opponents, then each creature declared as an attacker gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Whenever Resolute Blade Master or another ally enters the battlefield under our control, creatures we control get double strike until end of turn. Blade Historian gives double strike to attacking creatures we control, while Aimgrass Marauders doubles the damage dealt to permanents or players by sources we control. Imagine pairing double strike with the Marauders' double damage dealing ability. That's like double strike. When Odric, Master Tactician, and at least 3 other creatures attack, we choose which creatures block this combat as well as how those creatures block. Which most likely means that no creatures are blocking this turn. At the beginning of combat on our turn, Duke Alder Ravenguard gives another target creature we control haste and myriad until end of turn. Whenever a creature with myriad attacks, for each opponent other than defending player, we create a token that's a copy of that creature that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. These tokens are exiled at the end of combat. The Duke is a great source of board development. Speaking of combat, when Combat Celebrant attacks, we can exert it. If we do, then we untap all other creatures we control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. This relentless assault-like ability should be able to close out a game thereafter. For some humans that provide a little utility in the resource development department, Professional Facebreaker creates a treasure token whenever 1 or more creatures we control deal combat damage to a player. And in this build, we should be creating treasure tokens like nobody's business. If an opponent controls more lands than we do when Knight of the White Orchid comes into play, then we search our library for a Plains card and put it onto the battlefield. Esper Sentinel draws us a card whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, unless they pay X, where X is its power. Mentor of the Meek allows us to pay 1 whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control in order to draw a card. From a recursion standpoint, Gerard, Weatherlight Hero, offers a way to resurrect our humans. When Gerard dies, we exile him and return to the battlefield all artifact and creature cards in our graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Granted, this ability does nothing to save our creature tokens, as once they hit the graveyard, they cease to exist. However, Gerard's ability brings back our humans in order to reestablish our side of the battlefield after a board wipe. Drawing cards is awesome. Tutoring for specific cards can be even better. When Imperial Recruiter enters the battlefield, we search our library and reveal a creature card with power 2 or less from it and put it into our hand. Recruiter of the Guard does the same, except the creature card must have a toughness of 2 or less instead. Thalia's Lancers searches for any legendary card, while Ranger Captain of Eos searches for a creature card with mana value of 1 or less. It also has a sacrifice ability that prevents our opponents from casting non-creature spells this turn. This effect can be invaluable for the purposes of denying our opponents opportunities to interact with us or our board state during our game-ending turn. Speaking of interaction, let's include a few humans that interact with our opponents and their board states. Dranith Magistrate prevents our opponents from casting spells from anywhere other than their hands. Hopefully they weren't planning on casting their commanders this game. Grand Abolisher prevents our opponents from casting spells or activating abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments during our turn. Hopefully they weren't planning on interacting with us or our board state either. Creatures and non-basic lands our opponents control enter the battlefield tapped with Thalia Heretic Cather, and when Zealous Conscripts comes into play, we gain control of target permanent until end of turn. We untap it, and it gains haste. Imagine the possibilities. Now let's bring this video to a close by including some cards that synergize with and enhance our combat theme. Serra Ascendant is at, or near, the top of the list of humans we want to get onto the battlefield as soon as possible. It's just a 1/1 with lifelink, but it gets +5/+5 as long as we have 30 or more life. Just as a reminder, we begin with 40 life in EDH, and a turn 1 Serra Ascendant could make for a very quick game. With a bevy of creatures at our disposal, including Skull Clamp as an additional card-drawing resource makes sense. Whenever a equipped creature dies, we draw 2 cards. Its -1 toughness detraction could lead to immediate card-drawing benefits. Since the bulk of this build creates creature tokens, Anointed Procession is a consideration. This token-doubling enchantment can provide game-ending results. Throughout this video, we have showcased ways to create a very wide army led by Winota. Imagine how tall this army can become with Cathar's Crusade. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. This can get out of hand very quickly. For the purposes of enhancing our army and protecting them at the same time, let's add a copy of Iroas, God of Victory. This god gives creatures we control menace and prevents all damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures we control. Iroas is an indestructible enchantment that's only a creature if our devotion to Boros colors is 7 or more. This dynamic provides staying power on the battlefield, which both enhances and protects our Winota-led army. Since the overall theme of this build is predicated on getting creatures into play, let's benefit from this eventuality by including a couple of additional win conditions. Whenever a creature enters a battlefield under our control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent, while Perforos, God of the Forge, deals 2 damage to each opponent instead. Perforos's oft-forgotten power-boosting activated ability will serve this build well by giving creatures we control +1/+0 until end of turn for each 2 and 1 red mana we pay. Perforos is also an indestructible enchantment, and it's only a creature if our devotion to red is 5 or more. Our opponent's level of devotion to the continuation of playing Magic with us may not be as strong. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a combat-themed commander deck around Winota, Joiner of Forces as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting the core of a combat-themed EDH deck, in addition to providing ways to optimize this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.